concerned for a long time about how politicians in particular, policy makers, rely on the public interest to sell their reforms and their positions. And most often it happens like, we're making this decision or we're implementing this policy because it's in the public interest. And everyone's supposed to know what that means because they never talk about, well, what it means for them that something is in the public interest. And mostly when you start to dig down at what these decisions that are apparently in the public interest are all about, what you find is that they're often in the interests of serving the economy, for example, as if it's something that exists on its own account, rather than serving the well-being of people, the health of our society, the good of the environment. So it seemed to me that all of these things, which I believed were matters of public interest, were not being taken account of in what policymakers were talking about when they referred to the public interest.
What are some of the values underlying what they're talking about?
I think when you come from a position of hard-edged economic rationalism, or sort of a fundamentalist market sort of ideology, then the values that underpin that kind of stuff are, competition is good. Wealth will eventually trickle down. If there are wealthy people and we construct our economic system and our society so that a few people can earn a lot of money, then we don't need to be overly worried about that because eventually wealth will trickle down. I mentioned, I think, competition. The idea that competition is always good is one of the things that's at the heart of that. Also that people act solely out of their own self-interest, and that interest is about wanting material gains and wanting to be wealthy. So I think there's some of the values that underpin the neoliberal economic agenda that we see has so much power in our society.
What would you say are some of the effects on society of this view being dominant?
I think one of the things that we're seeing is a growing inequality, not only in Australia but certainly globally as well. There's this enormous gap that just continues to build between the very wealthy and the very poor in our world, and you can see all of the studies show that the small number of people at the top, the richest, are getting a greater percentage of the overall wealth of the world, and it's the same in Australia, in our country. So that growing inequity, I think, is a massive problem. I think climate change is also it's a symptom of this rapaciousness that we have to keep growing economically, that the only thing that we have to strive for is economic growth, and as long as we keep growing and our GDP keeps going up, we'll be fine. But in fact, what we're seeing is that this rapacious need for continual growth is actually damaging the planet. And when the planet is damaged, people suffer. And that's it. It's all connected. And I think it was at the time around the time of the GFC when a number of things collided, and many people started to think about the connection between things like ecology and the health of the environment and our economic systems, global and more local, and how they interacted and what impact they had on each other.
Can you explain what you think the values and ideas behind public interest and social good should be? Like what should it be about?
I think it should be about that the values should be about what it takes to build a flourishing society, a healthy environment, and an equitable an equitable arrangement between people, both nationally and globally. And I think some of the key values when you're looking at achieving those outcomes actually include such old-fashioned words as compassion, care for each other, generosity, hospitality, mindfulness of other people's situations. Those sorts of values, a focus on and an understanding of the interrelatedness between environmental well-being and human well-being. All of those things are really important, and for me, foundational to this idea of what is the common good all about? What do we have to do for the social good? What's actually in the public interest?
To get your reflections on some specific issues, you've written recently that we should promote a decent society where people care about each other, celebrate diversity, and welcome strangers. Now, I suppose I want to ask about the last bit of that, but how we deal with refugees and asylum seekers is one of the most prominent and vexed issues at the moment. But how should we be dealing with that, in your view?
Very differently to the way we're dealing with it now. I think as one of the richest, most secure countries in the world, Australia has a moral responsibility as well as international legal obligations to assist in the global problem of refugees and asylum seekers. Instead, what we see happening is that the government is turning people away, taking boats back to Indonesia, where people do not feel safe. And so this notion of turning people away when they have come to seek our care, I think, is an extraordinary thing to build an entire policy around and to use for political gain, which is what we've seen happening across both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party in Australia. This idea that you can punish vulnerable people in order to send a message to others is morally despicable, in my view. I don't know how we got to a situation where it is okay for our government to detain children in shocking conditions. And we've seen those conditions exposed recently through things like the Forgotten Children report from the Human Rights Commission. The government's response to that is, to be frank, abysmal. And I fail to understand how, in the context of the Royal Commission, for example, that's currently occurring into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, that the government can ignore cases of sexual abuse and generalise abuse and distress of children who are actually in our care.